りますので、等級に見合ったものを選んでください。あるいはベテランの方のパーティーに参加して。なあ、一緒に冒険に来てくれないか？君、神官だろ
？2018 was a bad year for a lot of things. It was a bad year for the United States, with a record number of school shootings occurring, multiple government shutdowns, and the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. It was a bad year for Europe, with Ukraine declaring martial law, the UK continuing to fumble Brexit, and the mysterious poisoning of a Russian double agent. It was a bad year for Asia, with Xi Jinping removing term limits, North Korea expanding its missile testing program, and the Iran nuclear deal coming to an end. It was a bad year for Africa, with Ebola breaking out in Congo, a corrupt election in Zimbabwe, and the passing away of former Secretary-General Kofi Annan. It was also a bad year for the Toto song Africa. Like, come on, what is this? Why are there two of these? Oh, well, I guess this one's not so bad. But, and I know that this is a cold comfort, it was a really good year for anime. We got numerous all-time classics in the form of Hanebado and Bunny Girl, as well as a veritable avalanche of quality light series such as Yuru Camp, A Place Further Than the Universe, Gakuen Babysitters, Grand Blue, and Zombieland Saga. We were also blessed with a handful of animation powerhouses in the form of Devilman Crybaby, Violet Evergarden, and Megalobox. Longtime favourites like My Hero Academia, Steins Gate, Cardcopter Sakura, and Gintama received well-regarded continuations, and even the anime community's favourite whipping boy, Sword Art Online, finally got a solid entry. That's a lot of good stuff across the board. But with the good must come the bad, and in 2018 we did have one real stinker on our hands. A show at once trite and heinous, and so devoid of artistic merit that I have reservations about even calling it anime. Indeed, last year we had to put up with the colossal failure that was the Junji Ito collection. Oh, and also Goblin Slayer. Goblin Slayer absolutely lit the anime world on fire in 2018. It was the most watched anime of the fall season across the entirety of the US. It was the second most discussed anime of 2018 on the Crunchyroll forums, surpassed only by the two-core Darling and the Franxx, and at the time of writing, Crunchyroll is running a renewed push for the series that covers a ton of their front-page real estate. Goblin Slayer undoubtedly has its fans, many of whom don't just like the series but genuinely love it, but that doesn't mean that the zeitgeist surrounding the series was entirely positive. Fact is that the discussion surrounding Goblin Slayer was incredibly heated and divisive, especially in the first few weeks following the release of its debut episode. So what was it that got people talking? For the unaware, here's the basic idea. Episode 1 of Goblin Slayer features two distinct scenes of female characters being brutally sexually molested by a pack of goblins in fairly graphic detail, along with another female character visibly peeing herself in fear. A lot of people were surprised by just how grim the events of the episode were and took umbrage with the perceived exploitational nature of the rape scenes. This was further exacerbated by the fact that Crunchyroll initially mislabeled Goblin Slayer as a TV PG-rated series. People on the other side of the aisle argued that Goblin Slayer is a dark fantasy show and that portrayals of rape shouldn't be shied away from, and that someone thinking the rape scenes were sexualized reflected more poorly on them than it did on the show. I must say that I strongly disagree with the latter stance. But this is not a video about the rape scenes in the first episode of Goblin Slayer. There are other angles from which to view the series which are in dire need of discussion. But I also think the last word on these scenes hasn't been said yet. I've been monitoring, if you will, the debate surrounding the first episode of Goblin Slayer, and I find that the consensus, or lack thereof, has come up very short, and I would like to add something to it. So we're going to kick things off with that, and then segue into the main point of the video afterwards, which I'm going to keep a surprise for the time being. So these two scenes then. I'm of the opinion that these two scenes sexualize the events portrayed within them beyond a shadow of a doubt. And that's a very bad thing, both because the events themselves are very gruesome, and because the aesthetic adds to the gruesomeness. The way the rape is framed and animated is what makes it so repugnant, but that is not something everyone agrees with. And to give myself a frame of reference from which to argue, I'm going to cite someone with a very different opinion from mine. This is YouTuber Dimitri Monroe, channel named The S. Monroe Show, from his video Lazy Critique Epidemic Goblin Slayer Too Edgy. Quote, "This scene is portrayed with screaming, blood, crying. There is nothing that inherently feels sexy about it. To the people saying that this is somehow sexual, I think that says more about you if you can look at a girl being violated in such a way and think, wow, this is sexy. End quote. And just as a side note, I'm only using Dimitri's video as a jumping off point, and I don't want to incite anything targeting him, so please leave him alone. Regarding his line of reasoning, I think there's a conflation of two notions at play here. Namely, the idea that saying something is sexy and saying something is sexualized are the same statement, but that is simply not the case. Deciding whether or not a work of art is sexy is the prerogative of the audience. They see something and they find it either sexually arousing or not. This, of course, happens on an individual level and not collectively. Now, a work of art being sexualized is an act on the part of the artist. Subconsciously or not, they formed their work in such a way that it is meant to evoke arousal. And maybe it will succeed, but it doesn't have to. What this means is that something being sexy and something being sexualized aren't mutually inclusive ideas. Something can be sexy and sexualized, it can be neither, or it can be only one of the two. A standard wallpaper pattern probably wasn't sexualized by its designer, but you never know. Someone might get their rocks off to it. A piece of pornography, on the other hand, is by default intentionally sexualized. But if the genre of porn that piece belongs to doesn't do it for you, then you might still not find it very sexy. Now, let's expand the scope of our terminology a bit. We're going to move from sexualized and sexy to made to appeal and appealing. We're going to use these terms to look at the portrayal of rape in media. Because the nature of art is such that even though we don't like the idea of rape, it can still be presented to us in an appealing manner. It can be made to appeal. Let's begin with music. Musical compositions are inherently tone pieces. We assign feelings to tones that make them evocative. So it's very easy to write lyrics about rape to a composition which invokes positive emotions, and people have done that. Remember this song from earlier? This is Sex Type Thing by Stone Temple Pilots, and I did not include it in this video without reason. It is a song sung from the perspective of an actual rapist. It is a commentary on the thought processes a rapist might use to normalize and justify their behavior. It also serves as a commentary on rape culture and the shocking frequency with which the victims of rape are blamed for the actions of the perpetrator. As a piece of writing, it's thoughtful, engaging, and deeply relevant. And there's one more thing this song is, and that is an absolute and total banger. It is a song that invites you to do some headbanging to it. But if you do, in a very, very abstract way, you're complicit in the thought process of the rapist. The music that you're rocking along to is just one facet of that after all. And just like that, the subject of rape has been displaced in such a way that it becomes appealing. I'm sure Scott Weiland, God rest his soul, didn't intend for the song to have that effect. In fact, I think he wanted the opposite. To him, the song was an exploration of the evils of sexual violence and abuse of power. But to the audience, it only becomes that if you engage with it on a deeper level, if you start to analyze the lyrics. On a surface level, all Sex Type Thing is a really good jam. Though in its defense, it is a very dark rock song, and because of that, it doesn't set the most joyful of tones. The same cannot be said for my next example. This is Scars of Yesterday by Dragon Force of all bands. It's a song about a mentally disturbed warrior or marauder taking the virginity of someone who is violently trying to stop him. It's probably the most narratively cohesive song Dragon Force have ever put out, in that it actually has a legible yarn instead of sounding like a Mad Libs version of a Robert Jordan book. But despite having a more concrete and disturbing narrative than most Dragon Force songs, Scars of Yesterday doesn't really deviate from the rest of their oeuvre on an aesthetic level. I think it's better than most Dragon Force songs, but you could imagine this playing over the final battle in a season of RWBY just as much as Through the Fire and Flames. point being, even something as terrible as rape can still be presented in a way that is meant to be aesthetically pleasing. This is true outside of the realm of music as well. Within pornography, a medium which exists almost exclusively for the purpose of titillation, there is a phraseology dedicated to categorizing rape or rape-adjacent content. Have you ever heard of the phrase dubcon, short for dubious consent? How about panal? And it gets more explicit than that. Go to any hentai site and I guarantee you rape serves as a dedicated content category. There is such a thing as live-action pornography meant to simulate rape as well. Long story short, in art, the subject of rape and an intent to be appealing can go hand in hand. So the question we're left with is the following. Are the rape scenes in Goblin Slayer presented in a way which either detracts from the horror of the situation or makes the situation more aesthetically pleasing than it would naturally be? Let's take a closer look. Leading up to this scene, the adventure party, consisting of a swordsman, a magician, a fighter and a priest, has entered the Goblin Cave and finds itself woefully underprepared. The wizard and the swordsman are both taken out of action, resulting in the female fighter having to protect the priestess. She manages to take care of a few smaller goblins, but is outgunned by a hobgoblin. Now, believe it or not, the questionable presentation comes into play as early as this. Following this moment, the fighter has her ankle either twisted or broken, is tossed against a wall causing her to bleed from her mouth, and tossed against a wall once more, resulting in a cracking sound. She is then thrown onto the ground, whereupon she is savagely beaten by a group of goblins wielding not just clubs, but knives and axes as well. That is a lot of physical abuse to take. And yet, when her clothes get torn off, almost no sign of physical damage remains. All that's left is light abrasion, the blood is gone, and the knives and axes seemingly never punctured her. The only blood that is shown after the fighter is undressed is the result of a puncture wound which is shown in extreme close-up. This cut is notably isolated from the rest of the scene to an absurd extent. The scene does not provide another wide shot of the fighter after this, with only another extreme close-up of one of her eyes being given before she exits the scene entirely. When we see her again near the end of the episode, all signs of the puncture wounds have disappeared while the priestess's wounds are still fully visible. It's not until the end of the episode, when she's clothed again, that her wounds are at their most visible. The effect of all this is that the image of the fighter being bloodied and the fighter being naked are never conflated on screen. We either see blood or the entirety of her body, and never both. If the main purpose of this scene is to communicate how dark this series is going to be, that there are no restraints on serious subject matter, why make this concession? I have no idea. I doubt this was done for the sake of the artist's convenience either, as blood and wound continuity in the show is actually fairly good across the board. At the end of the day, all this achieves is making the image of the fighter's naked body more palatable than it naturally should have been, and that's a weird thing to do in a scene where she is being sexually violated. Similar techniques are used when the goblins are assaulting the wizard, but it does feel less deliberate in her case. She is stabbed in the abdomen early on, a very weird moment where the bleeding immediately stops, and she goes from screaming to being passed out in the span of a single second. When we return to her later, the wound has been sealed, but the bloody stain still remains. As the goblins begin to tear her clothes off, the scene quickly moves to a different shot, one in which both instances of blood on her are blocked, and the only part of her body that moves is her chest. Don't forget that the wizard is unconscious when this happens. After the titular Goblin Slayer arrives, we get a wide shot of the wizard in which the blood on her abdomen is fully obscured. Moments later, when the emphasis is on her suffering, shadows which were not there previously are cast on her breasts. I think this cut, which is the very last above the bust visual of the wizard, is the only one in the entire episode which does the gruesome nature of the sexual violence full justice. Let's expand on the issue of framing a little more, because this is where things get really ugly. The cut where the fighter has her clothes ripped off is very brief. It lasts for approximately 2 seconds, but those 2 seconds are unbelievably poorly conceptualized. The most striking thing here is the manner in which the goblins are positioned. Even though the previous cut showed that the goblins are huddled around her so closely that she was bathed entirely in shadows, within the span of absolutely no time at all, one cut to the next, the goblins have spread out so far that the fighter's body can now be seen in full. The goblins tear the fighter's clothes off with a seeming complete lack of force just so we can see her breasts bouncing around as she writhes. In the very next cut, the focal point is a foot stomping the fighter's face into the dirt. 2 cuts later, the same angle is shown at a slightly wider perspective, and something very odd has occurred. The goblin stomping on the fighter's head is now behind her. This is one facet of the same trick being played again. The goblins are spread out in a way that is diegetically awkward just so we can see more of the fighter's body. Speaking of which, the pose the fighter is forced into in this cut is mind-blowing in how shameless it is. Face down and butt up, the goblins must be big fans of Two Live Crew. It doesn't even make sense for the goblins to put her in this position because they're all too short to have sex with her if her pelvis is raised this high. It's not done for the sake of the hobgoblin either, as he disappears from the scene entirely after he tosses the fighter to the floor. Reconciling this pose is nearly impossible. It is transparently obvious that what this cut does is attempt to add titillation to a scene which should not have it. This is exacerbated by the strange, thong-like length of cloth, which is the final bit of clothing the goblins tear off. Not only is it vaguely suggestive of lingerie, it also hides just how forced the fighter's pose is in this cut. Once the piece of cloth is gone and her silhouette is no longer broken up, it becomes clear that major artistic license had to be taken to have the fighter's butt, legs, and breasts all visible at the same time. The breasts are also the real kicker here, if you ask me. The fighter's breasts are portrayed as being fairly large for most of the episode, but once her clothes come off, they suddenly expand into giant anime balloon breasts. This change is fairly egregious while she's being held down, but it's at its worst while her clothes are being torn off. This scene is then closed out by a very unfortunate cut of half of the fighter's face. Her mouth is shaped and cropped in a manner which results in it being interpretable as a smile at a glance. She's also drooling now from the same mouth that, as you might remember, magically stopped bleeding earlier. And there you have it. Do I think the scene is sexy? No, I think it's terrible. But do I think it sexualizes the events that occur in it? Absolutely. That is the distinction that people who defend this scene get hung up on, I think. The generic elements of a rape scene are all here, generic as in the adjectival form of genre, that is. There is screaming, writhing, use of force by assailants, etc., and logic dictates that this makes the events portrayed unpalatable. But what makes something either appealing or appalling in a piece of art isn't its generic elements, it's the tone and the framing. And the tone and the framing of these scenes lean a little too heavily towards reinforcing positives in my eyes. The next thing you might ask yourself is, did the artists do this on purpose? And I would like to give them the benefit of the doubt and say no. But that doesn't mean that it was all a coincidence either. The issue that I assume to be at play here is that the default mode in which a naked woman is artistically portrayed is sexy. So if you draw, or in this case animate a naked woman and do that uncritically, that predisposition to make her sexy seeps in. If this is what happened, the animators should have been more aware of what they were doing and more careful to avoid what we ended up with. And I think that speaks more to a lack of prudence than anything else. The rape scenes in episode 1 of Goblin Slayer dominated the discussion surrounding the series well into its run. The show's detractors used them validly to justify why they were quick to stop watching it. Proponents of the show then responded to this by arguing why they found these scenes to be appropriate. The Goblin Slayer discourse then got caught in this vicious cycle, and I think that's a shame because there is something much more concerning about Goblin Slayer that needs to be discussed. Something kind of insidious about the series that is so all-encompassing that it cannot possibly have been accidental. And that is that the world of Goblin Slayer, in its entirety, is constructed to reinforce a fascist worldview. Talking about the nature of fascism as it pertains to art is difficult. Even talking about fascism as a political concept is difficult. The main reason for this is that fascism is such an ill-defined term. Scholars have been debating the term fascism since the fall of the only two self-described fascist regimes during World War II, and we still don't have anything resembling a consensus. Some even go so far as to say that we should do away with the term altogether. But I think there is value to the term even if we don't all fully agree on a definition. If nothing else, we do all share a broad view of what fascism means, we're just fuzzy on the details. And while that's not an ideal starting point for a discussion, the term fascism, however broadly interpretable, does indicate something that no other ideological descriptor does. You could argue that someone or a piece of work is totalitarian, authoritarian, nationalist, dictatorial, xenophobic, etc., but that simply doesn't cover the same ground as the term fascist. Now, that's not to say that the word fascist doesn't get thrown around unjustly, because it does. It's used both as a pejorative and to describe any number of ideologies which don't really fit the bill. I am fully aware of this, and I'm also aware that this has resulted in the word fascism losing some of its gravitas. But I'm not fooling around here. I'm not using the word fascist adjacent to Goblin Slayer to spark a prompt controversy or as an easy catch-all for a thing I don't like. Whether entirely by design or only partially, I genuinely believe that Goblin Slayer embodies this terrible ideology. But before I get into why that is, we're going to need to define the term fascism as it pertains to the thesis of this video. Otherwise, different people are going to walk away from this video drawing different conclusions based on their own definitions of the term. So, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to define fascism as totalitarianism plus. It is an ideology which props up wholly undemocratic totalitarianism not just for its own sake, but as an absolute necessity to preserve the sanctity of the state, which is under threat from a racialized outside force. Core to this ideology are three factors. 1. The ruling authority needs to have unchallenged and unchallengeable power over the state in its entirety. 2. The scapegoated enemy is not the enemy based on their ideology, but based on a trait inherent to their group. And 3. A belief that the preceding power structures were not fit to protect the state. Working with this definition, the next thing I want to make abundantly clear is what I'm trying to identify in Goblin Slayer. I'm not looking to find out if Goblin Slayer is fascist. I'm not even sure if you can say that about a piece of art at all, really. I'm also not interested in calling original author Kumo Kagyu a fascist, nor anyone who worked on the production of the anime. There are also no fascist power structures or characters who openly advocate for one in Goblin Slayer. What I hope to show in this video is that the fictional work of Goblin Slayer is constructed to invite fascism as the solution to its major problems. That is to say that the world, the enemies, and the heroes are characterized the way a propagator of fascism might characterize those same things in the real world. So, what's the plot of Goblin Slayer? It's quite simple, all things considered. After the Goblin Slayer and the priestess escape the cave, we quickly come to understand just how obsessive the Goblin Slayer is about killing goblins. It's all he wants to do with his life. The two go on a brief goblin killing adventure together before being recruited by another group of adventurers on a quest to prevent the resurgence of the Demon Lord. Someone else takes care of this in their stead, however, so they shift their focus to a magic mirror which acts as a portal to the goblins' homeworld. The first season ends with the Goblin Slayer and the rest of the Adventurers Guild fighting off a massive goblin attack on the Goblin Slayer's home. The storyline of Goblin Slayer is nothing to write home about. It makes for a very bare plot filled to the brim with worn-out fantasy tropes. But the story isn't the selling point of Goblin Slayer, the tone is. What sets Goblin Slayer apart from other fantasy light novel franchises is its supposed uncompromising nature. The Goblin Slayer is not a kind, cool hero, but rather a stunted loner who is driven entirely by his obsession. And the world pulls no punches, putting blood, violence, and rape on full display. Again, supposedly. But despite this, the morality of Goblin Slayer is portrayed in terms which are about as simple as those in an episode of Transformers. And that leads to a dangerous ideology being put on display. There is something inherently disturbing about the narrative vilification of an entire race, even if it's a fictional one. It speaks to a willingness on the part of the author to disseminate fear of someone not for what they believe or what they stand for, but for what they are born as. To a lesser extent, it is also a very unimaginative narrative shorthand. You don't have to justify what has led a group of people to act in an immoral way if it's their birthright to do so. An evil race as the enemy in fantasy fiction goes back as far as the writings of J.R.R. I know writers who use allegory and the raw cowards Tolkien, if not further. Plenty has been written about anti-Semitism seeping into Tolkien's portrayal of the dwarves, and his use of non-European physical features as negative indicators, some of it aiming to defend and some not. And while I do think parts of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings can be a bit unscrupulous with their handling of race, Tolkien at least showed a willingness to address racism within the margins of the text. Racism in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings is not exclusive to the narrative. It's present in the characters as well, and this is presented as a character flaw in each of them. One of the core themes of Lord of the Rings is friendship and solidarity across races and groups, after all.
I thought I'd die fighting side by side with an elf.
What about side by side with a friend?
I could do that.
The same is not always true of other works in the genre, all of whom draw inspiration either directly from Tolkien or from earlier derivatives, and it's definitely not true of Goblin Slayer. Neither the narrative nor the characters ever have any kind of sympathy for the goblins. The perspective of the goblins is rarely taken into account, and even when it is, any argument made to paint them in an even slightly more sympathetic light is immediately shut down one way or another. The first episode gives us a perfect example of this. After slaughtering a society of goblins inside their own home, the Goblin Slayer intends to finish the job by killing a roost of baby goblins. The priestess shows clear apprehension born of sympathy for the frightened children, but the Goblin Slayer is quick to inform her that goblins only ever grow up to be dangerous. In his own words,
生かしておく理由など一つもない。
善良なゴブリンがいたとしても。
善良なゴブリン。探せばいるかもしれん。だが、人前に出てこないゴブリンだけがいいゴブリンだ。
Rhetorically speaking, this is only one step above what Roosevelt had to say about Native Americans or how the arachnids are treated in Starship Troopers.
The only good bug is a dead bug.
A character in a work of art earnestly using the kind of rhetoric which is satirized in Starship Troopers should immediately make some alarm bells go off, in my opinion. This part of the scene is presented in an emotionally effective way, a sweeping orchestra in the background and the priestess crying as she listens to the screams of the children off screen. And while this might seem like the tone coming to the defense of the goblins, it's really not. It's not a sad moment because the goblins die, it's a sad moment because the goblins have to die. Their deaths are tragic, but they're treated as a tragic necessity, nothing more. Because the thing about goblins in Goblin Slayer is that they are, as a race, engineered to require complete destruction. In-universe, there are traits innate to them which make them a threat, no matter how marginal their society is. The Goblin Slayer says so in no uncertain terms in this very scene, informing the viewers that
奴らは恨みを一生忘れん。それに巣穴の生き残りは学習し、知恵をつける。奴らはすぐ増える。もう少し遅ければ50匹ばかりに増えて襲ってきただろう。
The goblins haven't merely developed a culture which serves as a threat to civilization, they are biologically designed to multiply fast, to hold grudges, and to overcome the failures of their predecessors. They cannot be redeemed, re-educated, or integrated. According to the Goblin Slayer's information, only the total genocide of goblins can eliminate them as a threat, and this is never refuted. If anything, the series continues to re-establish it. The Goblin Slayer repeats his mission to leave not a single goblin alive in the second episode, this time juxtaposed by a smiling guild girl and backed up by incredibly elating music.
燃え尽きたら生き残りを探して始末する。一匹たりとも残さん。
雑魚狩り専門と揶揄されようとも、あなたは誰かがやらなきゃいけないことをやっているんです。
A conversation between the Goblin Slayer and the Sword Maiden in episode 9 further serves to vindicate the Goblin Slayer's hatred of goblins entirely. The Sword Maiden, who is the embodiment of all that is worth protecting in this world, agrees with the Goblin Slayer's self-appointed mission. The goblins are to be exterminated entirely, and you won't find a soul who disagrees or even entertains the contrary notion. Another thing about goblins in this series is that they are unable to create and sustain their own ecosystem. In episode 6, the audience is told that goblins are exclusively a race of pillagers. They don't create anything themselves and have a parasitic relationship with the rest of the world. Exactly what it is that they steal is never made clear, but one can assume that the materials they use for their arrows and vehicles were stolen, if not the end products as a whole. They also don't build their own homes or villages. Worst case scenario, they live in caves and underground, but they are also shown living in expropriated fortresses and sewers. The only thing they create entirely by themselves is a toxicant, mostly for the purposes of killing or subduing others. One of the ingredients for this toxicant is their own spit, so on top of being a metaphorical poison on society, they are also a literal one. The worst way in which the parasitic nature of the goblins manifests itself is in their manner of procreation. The goblin race consists entirely of males, but that doesn't mean they reproduce asexually. Instead, if a goblin copulates with a woman of any other race and impregnates her, she will give birth to babies which are 100% goblin. Even the mere idea of it is disgusting, but what's most important to realize here is that the survival of the goblin race is predicated on the kidnapping and rape of women. This makes goblins the platonic ideal of a group of people who can be characterized as rapists by someone who fears them. Because goblins don't just have an inclination towards rape, it is part of their survival instinct. And what all of these parasitic traits of the goblins inform is that they are a pox on the world and nothing else. They are not merely a terrible part of the ecosystem, they exist exclusively to harm it and drain its resources. Things would only improve and nothing would change for the worse if they were gone. But the seemingly endless string of terrible traits assigned to goblins in the world of Goblin Slayer is not limited to their biology. Beyond their basic existence and necessities, goblins also show a propensity for malice. And most of the malicious acts they perform they seem to do without reason. If we take another look at the scene from episode 1 we covered at length earlier, it quickly becomes clear that goblins love to perform malicious acts for their own sakes. The fighter is tossed around, maimed and cut, even though the goblins intend to use her for breeding. And this is not an isolated incident. Goblins seemingly revel in the pain of others, going so far as to maim them, burn them, and drown them alive. The goblins' love of torture outranks even their need for survival, as they will gladly jump on women to assault them while they're in the midst of battle. They will also stop fighting just to laugh at the pain of others. Simply put, they are not shown to go for the kill in a fight, they much prefer to torture and hurt, even when it clashes with their overall goal. It is clear that any goblin being alive in Goblin Slayer is bad, no matter the context. Even when they are just sitting in their homes or standing guard, the series makes sure to add a sinister edge to it through lighting and music. If an alive goblin is bad, then a dead goblin must be good, and the series makes sure to present the death and pain of goblins as satisfyingly as possible. Whenever a human, elf, or other member of a protagonist race is hurt, their suffering is made to look terrible. It becomes a narrative event. Goblins are not provided this courtesy. Goblin deaths are usually quick, and they come about through satisfying hits with lots of blood exploding everywhere in an exaggerated manner. Compare that to the dirty sludge of blood that the protagonists get covered in whenever they are injured. Goblin suffering is rarely afforded this kind of time or attention. They are massacred quickly and with total disregard. Even when their pain is given screen time, it is more often than not treated as comical. Even though I've shown it multiple times by now, you might not have even noticed that in this scene the wizard kicks one of the goblins in the balls, a bizarre injection of humour into an otherwise dark scene. Humour at the expense of the goblins, of course. Even worse is when the unnecessary infliction of pain on goblins is treated as a moment worth celebrating, like in the Goblin Slayer's final battle with the Goblin Lord. Even in-universe, nobody has any regard for goblin suffering, not even their own leaders. They instead look down on them for being lesser creatures. If even their own superiors don't respect the goblins, how could anyone, including the audience, be expected to do so? There is, lastly, a major inconsistency in the way goblins are portrayed in this world. At the start of episode 1, it is emphasized that goblins are weak, barely even worth paying mind. Only the least experienced adventurers deign to deal with them. And yet they manage to make for an incredible threat. They savagely destroy the young adventurer party, and they regularly overrun towns, houses, and villages. Their assault on the Goblin Slayer's home at the end of the season requires the aid of the entire Adventurers Guild to stave off. Every major fight the Goblin Slayer and his party get into, they only win by the skin of their teeth. The goblins undeniably represent a major threat to the world, but this despite the fact that they are incredibly pathetic. They're easily picked off one by one, they're not good fighters, their craftsmanship is very weak, and they are not at all intelligent. Everything they can do, other races can do much better. So they at once pose a danger to society, and are presented as massively inferior to that society in every way. Individually they are utterly weak, but in their massive numbers, which they always have, they are strong. In-universe, this doesn't make much sense. There is no reason for the people to refuse to take the goblin threat seriously when they cause massive harm over and over again precisely because they are underestimated. But on a narrative level, this makes all the sense in the world. It means that the goblins can be whatever they need to be for the purpose of any given scene. In one scene, they can be utterly pathetic, a race which is lesser and doesn't even deserve to be mentioned in the same breath as humans, elves, and dwarves. And in another, they can be presented as an overwhelming force, one which will annihilate us if we don't annihilate them first. Thus, by continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. That last sentence might sound familiar, and that's because I didn't come up with it myself. It is probably the most famous line from Umberto Eco's essay Fascism or Eternal Fascism. Eco himself grew up in fascist Italy, and his writings have been key to the discussion surrounding the term fascism and what it means. And if how well it applies to the way goblins are portrayed in Goblin Slayer doesn't tell you anything, then I don't know what will. So the goblins in Goblin Slayer are designed to require total extinction, be a drain on the world, exist purely to cause pain, and to be at once an overwhelming force and pathetic subhumans. These are ways in which innumerable races and groups of people have been described by groups in power over the course of history. Jews in Nazi Germany and Chinese and Korean people in Showa status Japan immediately come to mind. But are the goblins supposed to be analogous to a real-world group of people? I'm not so sure. Goblins are traditionally seen, if anything, as stand-ins for Jewish people. The most infamous example of this is probably the goblin bankers from the Harry Potter series. With their propensity for money, their large noses and beady eyes, they embody the most negative and anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jewish people you could possibly imagine. It might seem unlikely that goblins in Goblin Slayer are stand-ins for Jewish people, however, seeing as Judaism doesn't have much of a foothold in Japan, but that's not necessarily a valid conclusion. Anti-Semitism in Japan is alive and well, and actually reached a fever pitch only a few decades ago. The famous anti-Semitic conspiracy text The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was translated into Japanese multiple times and sold incredibly well, as did anti-Semitic works published in the 80s and 90s by authors like Uno Masami and Ota Ryu. A 1988 poll conducted among the Japanese populace ranked Jews in Israel as incredibly untrustworthy. And Shoko Asahara, the founder of the Doomsday Cult which was responsible for the Tokyo subway gas attack of 1995, was a raging anti-Semite as well. So even though the Jewish community in Japan can charitably be described as marginal, anti-Semitism still lives on in the country. That is not to say that the goblins in Goblin Slayer were intended to be representative of the Jewish community, just that the possibility shouldn't be discounted. Goblin Slayer presents goblins as the perfect enemy, but not in a way that directly reflects real-world racism in the way that, say, Terra Formars does. That is a series in which the enemy race consists of dark-skinned, curly-haired, bug-eyed cockroach men who are really good at American football, wear golden chains, shoot pistols gangster-style, and drive around in Hummers like gangbangers, as well as presenting a hero in the form of a blonde white man who is the result of generations of eugenic science. Goblin Slayer displaces its vile hatred a little further than that. But the pedigree of Goblin Slayer does make one inclined to side-eye the series somewhat. Before the anime, before the manga, and even before the light novel, it was a choose-your-own-adventure forum thread on 2channel. 2channel is the Japanese predecessor to 4chan, and is much more popular than 4chan in relative terms. Content-wise, the two sites greatly resemble each other. Some of the posts are benign, a lot of them are questionable, and some of them are outright vile and dangerous. 2chan is, among other things, a major hub for nationalist rhetoric. Again, this is not to say that Goblin Slayer is a vile, nationalistic work, but it might have been born of such an ideology. In the original thread, the author uses ASCII images of pre-existing characters to represent his own. The Priestess, I believe, is a character from Dragon Quest, the Spearman is a Lancer from the Fate franchise, and the Swordsman is Guts from Berserk. Those last two were barely differentiated in the transition from thread to published work, incidentally. As for the goblins, they were represented by, Right. If that is not a smoking gun, then I don't know what is. When I first started writing the script for this video, I had a different order in mind for it. I wanted to open with this part and leave the discussion of the portrayal of the goblins for later, but it eventually dawned on me that this wouldn't be an effective way to get my point across. What I'm about to discuss is just how brutal of a person the Goblin Slayer is and how disturbing the lengths to which he is willing to go to exterminate goblins are, all the while still being unambiguously portrayed as the hero of the narrative. Herein lies a certain roadblock, because no matter how abhorrent one of the Goblin Slayer's acts might be, there can always be narrative justification. So no matter what I'm about to cover in this section, someone is bound to respond by arguing that the Goblin Slayer had to do it because it was the only option to fight back against the goblins. This is why I felt the need to cover the portrayal of goblins first. Because while reality moves as a result of actions and reactions, fiction does not. A story is not conceived linearly, event after event, it is conceived as concepts, characters, locations, and set pieces. To argue that whatever Goblin Slayer does is only done as a response to the Goblin Crisis misses the point, because both of these things are created by the author. Nothing in Goblin Slayer had to be the way it is, there was infinite room to write the world in whatever way you could imagine. So going forth into this section, I want you to keep in mind that everything the Goblin Slayer does is necessary only because of the way the goblins were written to be. I'm not criticizing the logic of the internal world forcing the Goblin Slayer's hand, I'm criticizing the fact that the world was written in such a way that these horrible actions seem justified. When someone asks a metatextual question, i.e., why was the Goblin Slayer written to stoop to such horrific measures, it is pointless to respond to that with a textual answer, i.e., because it was the only possible response to the Goblin threat. If you would like to listen to a longer explanation of this line of reasoning, I highly recommend watching Folding Ideas' video The Thermian Argument, which I'll link in the description. The video also sort of predicted both the events of Goblin Slayer and the backlash to them with a shocking degree of accuracy before the light novel was even released, so it's worth watching for that alone. So then, what does the Goblin Slayer get up to in his eponymous series? We've already covered the minor genocide, children and all, the Goblin Slayer commits in episode 1, but things get much worse than that. In episode 2, he burns an entire regiment of goblins alive. In episode 3, he initiates the murder of a duo of goblins seconds after their first appearance on screen. Episode 4, he desecrates the corpses of those same goblins, engages in chemical warfare against unsuspecting goblins before later drowning them. Episode 6, he once again engages in chemical warfare against goblins before drowning them, along with feeding them to an alligator. Episode 7, he leads a genocidal charge ending with the torturing of a goblin champion. Episode 9, another genocidal charge, this time with a triple-digit victim count. Episodes 11 and 12, he leads the entire Adventurers Guild in a fight against the goblins, again with hundreds of victims on the goblin side and 0 on the other. Devoid of context, these are all horrible things to do, but even in context, some of these actions are inexcusable. In episode 6, Goblin Slayer bombards a pack of goblins with the fantasy equivalent of Agent Orange for no reason. The group of goblins he's fighting is small by this series' standards, and yet the characters try to play it off like it's their biggest battle yet, and therefore everything goes. The sheer number of goblin deaths at the hand of the Goblin Slayer and his compatriots is staggering, easily numbering in the triple digits. This is doubly impressive when you consider that this is a 12-episode show, and 3 of those episodes don't even involve fighting goblins. It deserves to be said in no uncertain terms, the Goblin Slayer spends his time on screen committing one massacre after another, but that in and of itself is not the problem. Many TV series, both Japanese and Western, feature deeply morally compromised characters in starring roles. What sets Goblin Slayer apart from many of those series is how far it bends over backwards to portray the Goblin Slayer in a positive light and never question his motives or actions. Let's return to the scene from the first episode in which the Goblin Slayer kills a nest of baby goblins. Based on how much weight the scene puts on the priestess's terrified tears, one could argue that the audience is meant to take away that the Goblin Slayer's perspective is unreasonable, or perhaps even that he's lying. This could have made for an interesting subplot, the slow revelation that the Goblin Slayer is projecting all sorts of horrible traits onto goblins that they do not actually embody, but that is not what happens. During the final battle, the Goblin Slayer fights his most dangerous foe yet, a Goblin Lord. The Goblin Lord is strong, sadistic, and conniving, and has managed to develop these skills by repeatedly begging for mercy from roving adventurers. He even tries to attain the sympathy of the Goblin Slayer and the priestess to no avail. The point of this scene is to fully absolve the Goblin Slayer of committing infanticide, to prove that he was right about the dangers of leaving baby goblins alive, and once you take a step back and observe it on those terms, the sheer horror of it all becomes a lot more clear. There exists in this series a near complete refusal to explore the depravity of the Goblin Slayer's obsession with killing goblins. At his very worst, his obsession is treated as a funny fixation. It is played for comedy alarmingly often in this series.
ゴブリンか。
あ、いえ、ゴブリンじゃありません。だからって帰らないでください。
It's important to take note of the fact that it's not his murderous tendencies that are being played for laughs here, but rather the depth of his obsession. These gags could be about how much the Goblin Slayer loves drinking tomato juice, and nothing would have to be changed about them structurally. In other words, the nature of his obsession is backgrounded, while the depth of his obsession is foregrounded. And this warped perspective on the matter is not exclusive to the series' humorous moments. Whenever the Goblin Slayer is criticized for his obsessive behavior, it's never because his obsession is the genocide of a species, but because he's too obsessed with genocide.
それに彼、かなり来てるものね。ゴブリン退治だけと言ったって、何年もほぼ休みなし。
The fact that Goblin Slayer dreams of the eradication of goblins isn't a problem, it's the fact that he's so emotionally attached to it and that he engages with his desires with such abandon that makes it a character flaw. If only the Goblin Slayer would engage in his murder sprees with a more clinical attitude, the series seems to say. After all, if you're not taking part in the Goblin genocide, Goblin Slayer has no qualms about portraying you as a stuck-up fool. But the series isn't just preoccupied with painting the Goblin Slayer's quest as just, it also wants to make sure that the audience sees the Goblin Slayer as a just man. Someone who embodies all virtues you'd expect in a hero who is always right, never to be questioned. The audience is shown numerous scenes over the course of the series which don't really serve a purpose except to emphasize how good of a person the Goblin Slayer is. In episode 2, a big deal is made out of just how generous of a guest the Goblin Slayer is. He gives an unnecessarily large portion of his earnings to his host, who only accepts the money upon Goblin Slayer's insistence. This moment has two purposes. 1, it establishes that the Goblin Slayer is generous, and 2, it reaffirms that the Goblin Slayer kills goblins out of conviction. He's not in it for money, he's in it for justice. And despite being a dangerous obsessive, he still manages to be incredibly kind and somewhat charismatic. His preoccupation with goblins hasn't stopped him from caring for the well-being of others, for one. And despite praise being heaped on him constantly, he still manages to be incredibly humble.
とは行きますまいよ。詩人あればこそ武勲は語られ残るもの。
残してどうなる?
The Goblin Slayer doesn't have any real character flaws, ones that meaningfully impact him. His obsession with killing goblins doesn't get in the way of his or anyone else's ability to live their lives. As a character flaw, it's on the same level as tripping a lot. It's not a good trait to have, but it also does not affect character interactions in any meaningful way. The worst thing about the portrayal of the Goblin Slayer as a near-perfect figure is how often the narrative has to take the route of utter nonsense simply to prevent the Goblin Slayer's actions from being called into question. Neither the series nor the characters hold the Goblin Slayer to the same standard as the rest of the cast. In episode 4, the Goblin Slayer reprimands the archer for drinking too much water of all things, and the issue is dropped almost immediately, in his favour of course. Later in the same episode, the Goblin Slayer pulls a stunt that could have gotten the entire party killed, and it's never even brought up again. There are more egregious examples than that too. In episode 7, the Goblin Slayer's callous leadership makes the party fall into a trap in record time, and no one even deigns to mention it before or afterwards. Maybe the characters decide to give him a break on account of him nearly dying, but they have loads of time to give him an earful before that. In episode 8, the Goblin Slayer calls in help from high-ranked adventurers for seemingly no reason. One of them tells him off for it, but that character is consistently portrayed as a petty Burke, so it's safe to say the audience is not supposed to be swept along in his anger. It's exactly that which makes for one of the main contradictions in this show, one which helps the Goblin Slayer be both sympathetic and titanic. You see, all characters who can be considered major players in the series revere Goblin Slayer to some degree or another. The priestess looks up to Goblin Slayer like he's some kind of superhero, and his reputation has travelled so far that both the Elven and Dwarven languages have unique names for him. Episode 2 even ends with a bard quite literally regaling an audience with tales of the Goblin Slayer's achievements. And of course, as I've already mentioned, there's the Sword Maiden, who wholeheartedly condones the Goblin Slayer's quest for goblin extinction. The Sword Maiden being a character who is often portrayed wielding the scales of justice, just to assuage any sense of subtlety in her portrayal. All of this combined creates an atmosphere which encourages the audience to see the Goblin Slayer as an unambiguous, heroic figure. But this is not a great position for a protagonist to be in, because a character who is put on a pedestal, who is lionized by those who surround him, is difficult to relate to. So naturally, Goblin Slayer doesn't leave it at this. While all of the Goblin Slayer's allies, those who are close to him and presented as kind people, speak positively of him, the same isn't true for the extended cast. Within the Adventurers Guild, the Goblin Slayer is treated as a pariah. People think he's weird for focusing exclusively on goblins, and no one openly associates with him. You might think this serves to balance out the praise heaped on the Goblin Slayer by the core cast, but that's not really what happens here. The guild members don't represent an alternative point of view on the Goblin Slayer, they serve as social obstacles to the Goblin Slayer. Their opinion of him is never given room to flower and become a potential ideological source for the audience. These characters simply aren't relevant enough for that to happen. The only exception to this is the Spearman, who is so insufferable that it would take a lot of benefit of the doubt on the part of the audience to ever come to respect his opinion. What these guild members serve to do is to let the audience see the Goblin Slayer as an outsider, even though his closest compatriots idolize him and his ideology is proven to be correct by the narrative time and time again. That last part is especially important. The guild members are explicitly wrong. The Goblin Slayer doesn't deserve to be mocked for his mission because the goblins are a serious threat. And all of these characters have to face this reality at the end of the season, when they join the Goblin Slayer to defend his house from a massive goblin invasion. Through this final fight, it becomes clear that their way of doing things is incorrect, and it is the Goblin Slayer's methods and overall goal which represents what must be done to keep society safe. Taken in isolation, the Goblin Slayer being presented as a messianic figure who is not to be questioned isn't problematic. The same goes for his nature as an unrepentant goblin murderer. It's when you put these two elements together that you create a character who is not just a genocidal ideologue, but one who the narrative absolves not only of blame, but also the very need to be questioned and critically examined. I've seen a fair number of people compare the Goblin Slayer to the Doom Slayer from the 2016 reboot of the video game series Doom, and I think that that comparison is not valid in the slightest. On a surface level, they are both emotionless supermen who have dedicated their very lives to the destruction of a certain race and are revered for it, yes. But there are key differences in the narrative surrounding them that need to be taken into account. The first is that the demons in Doom, which are the race the Doomslayer slaughters indiscriminately, are not the villains of the game. Bear with me for a second. The demons in Doom are effectively rabid animals. They have no expansionist ideologies, and they are not responsible for their own presence on Earth. That honor belongs to the Union Aerospace Corporation. They opened up a rift to hell, and the demons are merely responding to being given more space to roam around. And unlike with the goblins in Goblin Slayer, the extinction of the demons is not the end goal of Doom. That is the closing of the portal to hell, which in turn requires the defeat of Samuel Hayden and Olivia Pierce. The demons are merely an obstacle on the path towards achieving that. Another important distinction is that the Doomslayer is not lionized by his allies. In fact, he doesn't really have any. Instead, everyone is kind of uncomfortable with him. Samuel Hayden uses him as a pawn who he knows he can barely contain, and the demons are scared to death of him and are desperately trying to kill him for good. In fact, a handful of demons were either created by the UAC from scratch or enhanced by them. They are victimized before the Doomslayer even finds them, and the game openly acknowledges this. The Doomslayer may be a force for good, but he's not a good force in and of himself. And that's the irony of drawing a comparison between Doom and Goblin Slayer. It puts a spotlight on just how disquieting Goblin Slayer's portrayal of its protagonist really is. Because not only is his ideology less sound than that of the Doomslayer, he is treated much less critically for it by the story he is in. And I think that says something about the differing ideas at play in these two works of art. And that is not something that reflects positively on Goblin Slayer.
I'm gonna take my horse to the old town road. I'm gonna ride till I can't no more. I'm gonna take my horse to the old town road. I'm gonna ride till I can't no more.
Here's a little fact you might be familiar with. Adolf Hitler was an avid painter. All the paintings appearing on screen right now are paintings made by him. There are a handful of recurring themes in his most famous paintings, such as unmolested pastoral vistas and stately homes. Perhaps this was a subconscious choice on Hitler's part, or maybe he picked these subjects on purpose, but either way, these visuals, the wholesome countrysides, are part and parcel of fascist ideology. One of the things that makes fascism effective at recruiting believers is an appeal to learned nostalgia. Fascism might seem like an extreme means, but if you can be convinced that what the world has lost under liberal society is immense, and that it can be revived through concentrated might and the removal of a certain people, you might also be convinced of the value of fascism. And this is what these paintings do as well. They appeal to a prelapsarian idyllic time period in which life was good, the world was beautiful, and all resources were plentiful. That era never really existed, of course, but if times are tough and if there isn't enough to go around, even if there's merely a perception of there not being enough to go around, it's easy to convince people that things used to be better, and that they can be like that again. When you're working with real life, there's a hurdle here. Because if society and the economy are in decline, either in reality or in perception, it is difficult to appeal to someone's sense of love for that society to light a spark in them. That's where this prelapsarian ideal fits in. Things used to be great, and they can be great again. But if you're creating a work of fiction, you don't have to deal with this hurdle. You can create a world which fully embodies this idyllic lost era, which is on the verge of being torn apart by a scapegoat. This would be a world worth protecting, and which needs protecting from the undesirables, let's say. It should come as no surprise at this point that Goblin Slayer is a prime example of this. And that's yet another reason why the first episode is so bad. I've seen a handful of people try to defend the events of the first episode by claiming that they set the tone for a complex, dark fantasy series. And I suppose that's true, but there is a small problem with that. Goblin Slayer is not a dark fantasy series. It may occasionally flirt with aesthetics or tropes that resemble those you might find in the Dark Tower or Glenn Cook novels, but the vast majority of Goblin Slayer's runtime is spent in a world which more closely resembles a run-of-the-mill isekai light fantasy world. This isn't the tone of Goblin Slayer, this is. The amount of time spent engaging in gore-spewing fights is vastly overshadowed by scene after scene of characters conversing in the Guildhall or enjoying a day out on the town. The world of Goblin Slayer is nothing short of bucolic. It looks lovely, it's a great place to live, and it's almost entirely free of strife. That last thing is especially important. There is a complete lack of conflict that isn't caused by monsters in Goblin Slayer. There is no political discord, there are no bandit alliances, racism is limited to light banter, and seemingly no one's livelihood is ever in jeopardy. Life in Goblin Slayer is so Elysian that characters have time to take the day off, travel for miles and eat ice cream in the town centre. It's a world which resembles medieval Europe but appears to be off much better when it comes to the economy and society. This despite the fact that the world is supposedly overrun by monsters much more dangerous than any animal we deal with in reality. Every major hub needs an adventurers guild with dozens of members to keep the surrounding areas safe, but we never so much as get a glimpse of the troubles these adventurers are supposedly preventing. We are told that society is feeble, but nothing ever actually slips through the cracks. That is, of course, with the exception of goblins. Whenever a problem arises in the world of Goblin Slayer, it is invariably caused by goblins. In the 12 episodes of Goblin Slayer, there is not a single interhuman conflict worth mentioning. No other kind of monster ever visibly causes trouble either, despite the fact that most of them are more dangerous than goblins as far as we're told. The only exception to this are the giant rats which overrun the sewer, but giant rats making a nest out of the town's plumbing doesn't compare to villages being ransacked and women being kidnapped, which is what goblins tend to do. Though, oddly enough, this only ever happens off-screen or in flashbacks. With the exception of the final battle at the farm, the goblins never mount an assault within the present-day time frame of the series. There is the attack on the Goblin Slayer's village, which happens in the past, the assault on the Sword Maiden, which also happens in the past, and a village being overrun by goblins in the present, which the audience is made privy to by someone bringing it up at the Adventurers Guild. It is never actually shown. All of the fights the Goblin Slayer and his team engage in, again with the exception of the battle at the farm, are campaigns of offense. They never fight on their own home turf, they're always engaging the goblins either in goblin territory or in settlements that the goblins have conquered. This would be the most blatant instance of expansionist ideology the series has to offer if it weren't for the fact that goblins do pose a threat to society, just never on screen. In the way this allows two contrasting truths to coexist, this is genius. At once, the righteous kingdom can be beautiful and peaceful, and its fighters can always be on the offensive, all the while the goblins continue to threaten the basic stability of society, putting it on the back foot. It is very clever storytelling that is unfortunately used to engender more underhanded duplicity in the series. Tactically speaking, the protagonists of Goblin Slayer are always the aggressors, and yet there is always the implication of some prior goblin assault to justify this aggression. But that goblin assault needs to happen away from the present visible reality, lest the image of the beauty of society be tarnished. For a series as ostensibly mature as Goblin Slayer, it is surprising how lacking it is in detail. In the 12 episodes the series consists of, so little world building takes place, it's almost baffling. Goblin Slayer wastes so much time showing characters eating ice cream or engaging in endless goblin murder sessions that one might think the series has too much time on its hands, and yet we know next to nothing about the world it takes place in. The entire series takes place in two cities and their immediate surroundings, and everything else is left a mystery. This serves to benefit Goblin Slayer in a very specific way. It can be implied that society has no problems without having to engage with how difficult to believe that is. Let's take rulership, for example. We don't know what kind of regencies exist in the world of Goblin Slayer. Has the land been divided into countries or empires? Or maybe population centres are limited to city-states with vast swaths of unclaimed land between them. Well, no one knows, and that works to the series' favour. Because if the audience doesn't know what kind of rulership is in place, they cannot question its inconsistencies. And inconsistencies there would be, because it's difficult to believe that there could be peaceful rule in a world where monsters are a constant threat. If the ruler, be they king or democratically elected, is benevolent, then how is it possible that their rule isn't constantly being threatened with insurrections? If the ruler is an autocrat, then how come everything is so peaceful? Remember, this is not a light fantasy series. You cannot gloss over these issues by saying things just work without losing a ton of narrative credibility, but Goblin Slayer does do that. On the question of regency, it seems to say, don't worry about that, it's going smoothly. Let's worry about these goblins first. And by doing this, the idyll of the world of Goblin Slayer is kept intact by flat out ignoring what should be areas of conflict. Simply leaving things that don't make sense unmentioned is a very childish way for an artist to achieve the world they want to achieve, and this applies to other factors in Goblin Slayer as well. Take the issue of racial harmony for another. Numerous fantasy races coexist in the world of Goblin Slayer. Besides humans, you have elves, dwarves, lizardmen, padfoots, and some others as well. These races live in de facto segregation. The two towns most of the series takes place in are human settlements, and very few of its denizens are members of other races. The elves, dwarves, etc. predominantly live elsewhere. Whether they have their own countries or merely cities is of course not entirely clear, but what is clear is that the races don't intermingle much. That is a bit strange in and of itself. You'd think there would at least be small enclaves of most races everywhere, but it seems the world of Goblin Slayer effectively consists of a series of ethnostates. Because of this, it is doubly weird how little prejudice there appears to be in this world. If you think about it, it seems unlikely that these races would get along so well. They have very disparate cultures, it seems they all have their own languages as well, and most importantly, interactions between races are fairly rare if the events of the show are anything to go by. So then, how is it possible that these races don't clash? The closest the series ever gets to portraying racial tension is light racist ribbing between the elven archer and the dwarven shaman. The fact that they share these interactions is plausible in my opinion, because the Goblin Slayer's party has known each other for some time already, so they might have already worked through most of their racial biases. As for the rest of the world, it's more difficult to swallow their progressiveness. Most of the characters in the series, both major and minor, might not even see one person of a different race in a month, and the same goes for their social circles. And yet somehow, racial tension is nowhere to be found. The exclusively human Adventurers Guild has nothing to say when a lizard man walks in, something that has to be a rarity. The Goblin Slayer's party shows up talking of an unforeseen threat to life, and it's simply accepted as read. All of this is plain unbelievable. Prejudice against other groups cannot be dispelled in a racial vacuum, at least not on this scale. So what we see in Goblin Slayer is a world which is post-racial culturally, while enforcing near absolute racial segregation. And why? Well, for the same reason there is no political strife, because it allows for the narrative to laser focus on goblins as the only threat. If there is no unity among the initiated races, there can be no unity against the scapegoat. What this means is that the narrative has to bend over backwards and abandon plausibility for one of its elements just to make the goblins the sole enemy force. And not only is there no racial tension in Goblin Slayer, there is virtually no tension of any kind that isn't caused by goblins. With the single exception of an instance of theft which is cleared up within the span of one scene, there is no interpersonal conflict in this series of any kind. The characters are all nice and well-meaning. Some of them are a bit hot-tempered maybe, but they all have each other's best interest at heart. Even the Spearman, the most obnoxious of the guild members, doesn't ever engage in any untoward behaviour. The characters can sometimes be rude, yes, but they never do anything that is detrimental to the well-being of others. The closest the series gets to introducing a character whose presence is genuinely hurtful is the Goblin Slayer's mentor, who only appears in flashbacks. He is incredibly emotionally abusive towards the young Goblin Slayer, but his actions no longer actively affect the narrative because he's not present in the current day. It's also worth noting that the only heinous non-goblin character in the series still bears a significant resemblance to goblins, even though he's supposed to be of a human-adjacent race. A lack of conflict in a story is not a problem in and of itself. In fact, I'm of the opinion that we could do with more slice-of-life works being produced. The problem is that a serious fantasy narrative feels flat without it. Any story in which the only conflict comes about from a very clear divide between good and evil with a complete lack of nuance simply isn't very mature. So Goblin Slayer 2 is not mature. In fact, it's incredibly juvenile. Blood, dismemberment, and rape do not elevate a story to being more mature. That's what fleshed out characters, complicated morality, realistic worlds, and themes and ideas are for. And Goblin Slayer has none of that. It only has a hatred for goblins, and it sacrifices constructing a believable, engaging universe to enforce that hatred. Besides Doom, another common work of art for Goblin Slayer to be compared to is the manga series Berserk. This is yet another comparison that I completely disagree with. Berserk has had its problems with indulging in rape and violence entirely for their own sakes, but it has made tremendous strides over the course of its 30-year run on its way to becoming one of the best manga of all time. Its characters have depth and its world is well established. The morality and conflict of the series are dense, and even though the central narrative is about two clashing factions, there is so much more to it than that. And Berserk's use of violence and sexual assault is very much purposeful. Looking back at the infamous rape horse scene, it feels so out of place now compared to the incredible pathos with which Guts' history with rape and the rape of Casca are handled. Every instance of sexual assault in Goblin Slayer is brushed to the sidelines after it comes to an end. Guts, on the other hand, is still recovering from when he was molested as a child, and depending on how you look at it, the rape of Casca, which occurred over 20 years ago, is still the focal point of Berserk today. Berserk's core themes are forgiveness and redemption. About Griffith, the series asks, could someone be forgiven an atrocity if the consequences of it are no longer palpable? And about Guts, the series asks, can someone be better than the very worst they've ever been? These are questions which still need to be answered, and by the end might be left for the reader to answer for themselves. The only theme Goblin Slayer has is that goblins are bad and deserve to be exterminated, and on this front it raises no questions that the series doesn't answer itself, and the answer is always the same. It's always kill more goblins. Goblin Slayer is a nightmare to talk about, to me at least. There is an abundance of fascist-adjacent elements slithering about in the series, which I find horrifying, and yet I can't bring myself to condemn its creators. Not because I think Goblin Slayer has greater value outside of these elements, in fact it's the opposite. Goblin Slayer simply isn't very good or well written. The plot is clumsily constructed, the story is filled with inconsistencies, character depth is kept to an absolute minimum, and tabletop RPG tropes are used in place of world building all the time. And it's based on source material that is even more poorly written based on what little I've read of it. It's clear that very little deliberation occurred in the creation of this universe. Goblin Slayer is ill-conceived in the most literal sense. And if even the basics of the story are this undercooked, you can only imagine how little thought was put into the deeper implications of the series. I wouldn't be surprised if the fact that Goblin Slayer reads like a fantasy rewriting of the Turner Diaries, or maybe more appropriately 1,000 Miles of Winds, never even crossed Kumo Kagyu's mind. Goblin Slayer represents a very disturbing ideology, but I don't think all of it was on purpose. As a fantasy analogue to fascist propaganda, I think Goblin Slayer is an accidental creation. But Goblin Slayer being a piece of wish fulfillment featuring a Superman committing genocide against an entire impoverished species, that is just the basic premise. I don't think Kumo Kagyu or anyone who had creative influence over the manga and anime adaptations of Goblin Slayer are fascists, but it does appear that they did not recognize the scary ideas that are at play in their works, and that alone is bad enough. These ideas are present in Goblin Slayer, and whether they were put there out of malice or out of dereliction doesn't matter, they send the same message to the audience either way. If you're only going to take one thing away from this video, I want it to be this. You should always be wary of works of art which define the enemy not at the hand of their ideology, but by inherent factors such as their race. This is a bad thing no matter how clouded it is in the unreality of the fiction. It doesn't matter if the antagonists are goblins or skrulls or real races as we currently observe them in reality. What matters is the line of thought, that an enemy is an enemy because they are a certain something instead of because they believe a certain something. Because no matter how disconnected the vilified race is from any real race, the ideology that makes them villains can easily be transplanted into reality. Because if one believes that goblins can be villains just for being goblins, then they are not far away from believing that, say, Zhuang people are villains just for being Zhuang people. That's obviously wrong, but people do believe those sorts of things, and shows like Goblin Slayer aren't helping to change that. This is the kind of media savviness that is important to have. It's crucial that people are aware that works of art push ideologies, and that you do not have to accept those ideologies as they are, but instead think about them critically. I would much prefer you watching Goblin Slayer and maybe even enjoying it while thinking about everything I've discussed in this video, than you never watching Goblin Slayer and this video going in one ear and out the other. If you've made it this far into the video, then I have to say thank you so much for biding with me. I'm sorry that the first part of this video about the rape scene was so disconnected from the rest. By the time I realised how superfluous it was, references to it in the second half were so entrenched in the script that I couldn't change it anymore. I hope you got something out of both halves of this video either way. I can imagine the first half of this video being a bit hard to sit through, so if it's any consolation, I can tell you this. The portrayal of non-consensual sex in anime can be much, much worse than that, and it has.
Black wings across the sky bring the nightfall. Winds whine around the stars, black riders call. Light fading, time's wasting. Hell's waiting for the Dark Lord. Towers lean, glowing red eyes in their walls, watching the roads that lead to the downfall. Eyes flashing, rain lashing, death in the name of the Dark Lord. Oh, yeah. Doom stands astride the plains, watched by the eye, wet by the dying rain from the dead sky. Dust swirling, smoke curling, burning domain of the Dark Lord. Tunnels of darkness yawn, the moment draws nigh. Too late the black wings beat, too late the cry. Death flying, light dying, tearing the veil of the Dark Lord. Yeah, yeah. Oh.
Oh, there's one more thing I really need to mention. Even on a paratextual level, this show makes sure to champion the Goblin Slayer in absolute terms. The opening theme song is literally called Rightfully.